Hi, welcome back to my home studio. I'm Erin, a contemporary embroidery artist and an instructor at Oil and Cotton. In case you missed our first two videos, Oil and Cotton is located in Oak Cliff in Dallas. It's an art supply store and an art studio where you can take classes in person and online. This is the third video in a series about botanical embroidery. If you missed our first two videos, we'll leave links to those below so that you can check them out. Today, we're going to collect our own plant specimens and then create a unique work of embroidery. Here's an overview of today's lesson. You can check the description box below for timestamps if you need to jump to a certain part of the video. Before we get started with our art making, I'd like for us to gather some inspiration from artists who incorporate plants into their work.
When we look at plants, both in the arts and in the sciences, it's important to remember that plants are organic. They decay over time. Before photography, people would collect plants and then press and dry them out and put them in bound books in order to identify and preserve them. These books were called herbariums. One famous example that you see here of an herbarium is the one created by the American poet Emily Dickinson. Because plants are so hard to preserve, in the 19th century, a botanist in Germany asked two glass artists, Leopold and Rudolf Blaschka, who were Czech, to create a library of plants made out of glass. And that brings us to a contemporary artist named Heidi Norton, who incorporates live plant specimens into her works of art. She uses them to explore her own relationship with nature and to the environment, but she also plays with the idea that plants are not immortal and that they have to be preserved. So she uses resin and wax in her work to highlight the ways that we try to preserve these organic plants that otherwise would die. Now that we've learned about the history of incorporating plant specimens into works of art and seen the contemporary work of Heidi Norton, I think it's time for us to start our own art making.
For today's project, you will need an embroidery hoop. Mine is 8 inches, but you can use whatever size you have on hand. Embroidery floss. You can choose whatever colors you want to work with. I have 4 different colors here. A needle. Scissors for cutting your fabric. And then fabric. So I have a couple different options here. You could choose a sheer fabric. And what's interesting about that is when you use a sheer fabric, you can see your stitches through the fabric. I don't have enough of this today to choose this type of fabric, but I did use sheer fabric in my original example that I made. And then I also have a brown and a white, so I'll be selecting between these two for my project. And then the last thing you need are some specimens that you've collected from your environment. The leaves that I have, I've let them dry out overnight. It's really good to press them in a book so that they dry flat. But you'll also see that I have sticks, rocks, and even some dried out pecans. And just a reminder, whenever you're collecting specimens from nature, you just want to make sure that you're not damaging the environment and that you're also being safe and avoiding any harmful plants like poison ivy.
Begin by cutting out your fabric so that it's 1.5 inches larger than the perimeter of your embroidery hoop. My fabric was already the right size. Separate the 2 rings of your embroidery hoop. You may need to loosen the screw at the top to do so. and then place the inner ring on your tabletop surface. Place your fabric over top, and then place the outer hoop on top of your fabric so that it's sandwiched in between the two hoops. Next, we want to make sure our fabric is nice and tight inside of our hoop. Begin by tightening the screw at the top of your hoop, and then tug in a circular motion all the way around, pulling on the fabric. Then repeat this process. Tighten the screw at the top, tug in a circular motion around, and keep going until your fabric is nice and taut inside your embroidery hoop. Next, experiment with the composition of your collected plant specimens on top of your embroidery hoop. Just like in the last video, I encourage you to experiment, and even if you find a composition that you like, continue to rearrange your plant specimens. You can always go back to that other one if it is the one you prefer, but that way you can explore a little further. Once you've decided on your composition, I recommend taking a photo. Next, you'll need to decide which part you want to begin with. I selected this leaf because it was at the very back of my composition underneath a stick, so it seemed like a good place to start. Next, you'll want to split your floss, thread your needle, and start stitching. If you need help with any of these steps, check out the first video in this series where we made a plant sampler. I go over all of them and include step-by-step guides to doing certain types of stitches. For this leaf, I decided to use the seed stitch, and I started with that center portion of the leaf, and I used that ochre yellow color, and then I went in with a different color for two of the other leaves to create some variety. This leaf is actually a weed, so even though it had been dried, its edges were still kind of sticky and rough, so my thread kept getting a little bit caught on the leaf. You should find that your needle is able to easily pass through both the fabric and the leaf as you stitch, and the more stitches you add, the more secure your leaf will be. You just want to be very gentle with the leaf. As it's very dry and crinkly, it would be easy to accidentally rip it or damage it. But if something like that does happen and it's not planned, don't worry and go ahead and just incorporate that into your design. I moved on to my next group of leaves that is here at the top of my composition. I started by focusing on the stem, and I used 2 simple stitches to create a small X and repeated that at several different points along the stem. Before, I had been using the seed stitch, which was contained within the previous leaf I was stitching. With this one, I wanted to experiment with stitches that went over the side of the leaf. So I used large, simple stitches to attach the leaves to my fabric. As I'm choosing which type of stitches to use, I'm just trying to respond to the plant, the overall composition that I have, and I'm experimenting a little bit. And I encourage you to do the same. I'm sharing what specific stitches I'm using in case you want to replicate them, but feel free to go off on your own and try something new. Next, I started working with the stick, and I essentially used a straight stitch to almost wrap the stick with embroidery floss. So I came up one side and then back down the other, up one side and back down the other, and repeated one more time so that you would get this pattern. While I was stitching, I used my thumb to hold the stick securely in place. I was sure to keep my stitches pretty close together underneath the stick, and that just helps to keep the stick secure and to make sure that the floss wraps tightly around it. And then it's also important to tie a secure knot on the back and keep your stitches very tight. I really enjoyed the X's that I used on the other stem, so I went back in with a different color with white and added some decorative X's as well. And the final element in my composition are these two limestone rocks. These are probably the most delicate part of the embroidery, and just a reminder, this whole embroidery is very fragile, so you'll want to store it in a safe place and be very careful with it. Securing the rocks is very similar to the same simple stitch we were using on the stick. So we're basically wrapping the rock. So coming up one side, down the other, up one side, down the other, and then flip it over very carefully and tie a secure knot. Next, I moved on to the second smaller rock and used that same method in a darker gray to secure it. And then I looked at my composition for a minute and decided that I would like to add additional stitches to secure the rocks in different directions, both for the sake of the way it looks and to help secure those rocks a little bit more. And here is our completed project. Thank you so much for following along, and we'd love to see your work of plant specimen embroidery. Please share it online. We'll leave our information below.
I really hope you've enjoyed making embroidery using plant specimens that you literally can find in your own backyard. As I mentioned, there are 2 other videos in this botanical embroidery series that I encourage you to check out if you haven't already seen them. I have had so much fun creating these videos and making these lesson plans, and I hope that you've had just as much fun watching them and making your own artwork. If you have liked these videos, please check the description box below to check out ways that you can support Oil and Cotton, who have presented these videos for free. You also can find links to learn more about me and my work. Thank you so much for watching. Happy stitching. Bye!